May 8, 1945 Victory in Europe Day. While church bells pealed across Britain and crowds whirled and sang in Trafalgar Square, an entirely different scene was playing out in a rain-soaked field beyond Hamburg. The order was given quietly, almost gently, yet it sliced through the strain like a surgeon's blade through silk. "Take it slowly." The German women went rigid, eyes widening with stunned disbelief. They looked from one another to the British soldiers crouched before them, bowls of hot soup cradled carefully, spoons held with intentional steadiness. No one moved. No one even seemed to inhale. They knew the stories, the rumors whispered endlessly through the camps, murmurs that followed them into sleepless nights. They had imagined the worst, replayed unspeakable scenarios in their minds until fear itself became familiar. And now, as the British soldiers edged nearer, raising spoons toward quivering lips, one chilling thought surged through them like ice flooding their veins. Why are they feeding us by hand? What do they intend to do to us? Stay until the very end to grasp the crushing truth behind that instant, and how the women's terror transformed into something utterly unanticipated. In the war's final, frantic months, Germany was hemorrhaging from the inside. The Third Reich, which had vowed to last 1,000 years, had disintegrated in scarcely 12. Cities lay shattered, reduced to hollow skeletons of former greatness. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, once proud capitals, now sprawled as oceans of debris and soot. Infrastructure that had been a source of national pride was now nothing but mangled rail lines, blown bridges, and roads gouged into impassable scars. Food was rarer than gold. Civilians clutched ration cards that offered barely enough calories to remain alive. Black markets flourished in the darkness, where a single loaf of bread could cost a treasured heirloom, where frantic mothers bartered wedding bands for powdered milk. The intricate supply networks that had sustained Germany's war engine for years had collapsed entirely. Storehouses stood bare. Farms were deserted. Laborers were dead, drafted, or gone. For women assigned to auxiliary military duties, survival was even more uncertain. They were not frontline fighters, yet they had been essential to Germany's war effort all the same. They worked as clerks, carefully cataloging documents in underground shelters, hands blackened with ink and carbon sheets. They served as radio operators, headsets pressing into aching ears for endless hours as they transmitted coded messages they barely comprehended. Others were flak auxiliaries, scanning the skies for Allied bombers, manning searchlights and early warning posts, hauling ammunition to guns firing desperately into the clouds. When positions collapsed, they marched for days, sleeping wherever shelter could be found: chart houses, empty barns. Survival depended on anything they could find: hardened bread soaked in water, potatoes more rot than substance, wild plants eaten with no certainty of safety. Some endured days without real nourishment. Their bodies withered, cheeks hollowing, eyes sinking deep. Uniforms once tailored now sagged from skeletal frames. By the time British forces reached them in those chaotic final weeks, they were fragile shells of exhaustion. Their nerves were stretched tighter than wire, and trust even among one another had nearly vanished. They expected cruelty. Years of propaganda had insisted the enemy was ruthless, that the British were distant and unfeeling, that vengeance would be swift and merciless. They anticipated punishment for serving the regime, however indirectly. They expected to be treated as foes, because that is exactly what they were. Nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for what followed. The women were gathered in silence, guided into a rough assembly area near what had once been a German supply depot. British soldiers approached with measured restraint, without hostility, without hatred in their eyes. There were no barked orders, no rifle stocks raised, no threats laced with spite. Only calm directions, sometimes spoken in fractured German, sometimes translated. The women did not believe it. How could they? Compassion from an enemy felt impossible, absurd. It clashed with everything they had learned, everything they believed. The contradiction left them reeling. They were escorted, marched feels too harsh, to a temporary internment camp the British had organized with striking efficiency. Rows of canvas tents stood aligned. Medical posts were already operating. Latrines were positioned carefully away from water sources. The orderliness was precise, almost clinical. The women were issued blankets, real wool, not ragged scraps, and told to rest, to ease the strain on their bodies. But rest felt alien, a privilege they no longer trusted. Their limbs trembled with exhaustion, hunger, and dread of what might still await them. Younger women sobbed softly, hiding their faces. Others sat frozen, eyes tracking every sound in shadow. Older women, veterans of the First World War's aftermath, wore expressions of grim acceptance, braced for whatever judgment was coming. Then the wind carried a scent that made several gasp. The smell of genuine food. Not the thin gruel they had scavenged, not mold-ridden scraps fought over, but real meals: meat, vegetables simmered in broth, fresh bread still warm from British field kitchens. Some stomachs twisted painfully at the aroma, others flooded with saliva for the first time in weeks. Yet hunger brought fear with it, sharper, deeper, more confusing than anything before. British soldiers appeared with heavy pots of stew, baskets of bread, tins of hot tea. The women stared, torn between desperate need and deep suspicion. Every movement was scrutinized. Some whispered urgently, terrified, "It's a trap. They want us to lower our guard." Others feared punishment. "If we eat too fast, we'll be punished." Recalling brutal discipline where reaching for food earned rebuke. Beneath these thoughts lay something darker, suspicions of poison, visions of quiet revenge, the belief that the enemy might finish the job discreetly. "Why else would they feed us?" one murmured, her reasoning warped by starvation and fear. "We're the enemy. We cost them supplies. It would be easier to..." She stopped. She didn't have to finish. Everyone understood. As the British soldiers moved from woman to woman, handing out bowls with careful precision, the reaction was not relief, it was dread. Hands extended hesitantly, then withdrew. Some women's hands shook so violently from weakness, anxiety, and sheer overload that they could not steady the spoon. Utensils rattled against metal bowls, producing a nervous clatter that rippled through the camp. Others were simply too frail. Days without sufficient nourishment had robbed them of strength and coordination. Fingers failed to close properly. Arms lacked the power to raise even a light spoon again and again. The British soldiers noticed at once. They had been instructed, had been trained, had witnessed this before in other liberated camps. They exchanged glances, some worried, some compassionate, all resolved. Then they made a choice the German women could not comprehend. The soldiers knelt beside them. They gently removed the spoons from shaking hands. They dipped them into the bowls, testing the heat, measuring the portions, and then raised the spoons toward the women's mouths and spoke words that locked every prisoner in place. "Take it slowly, Lancome. Slowly now." The British soldiers leaned in, offering those first spoonfuls by hand, as one might feed a child or someone bedridden with illness. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The women recoiled as if struck. Some physically jerked backward, their backs pressing against whatever was behind them. Others flinched so hard that nearby women started as well, creating a ripple effect of panic. One woman turned her head away entirely, her eyes squeezed shut, her entire body rigid with terror. They didn't know why the soldiers were doing this. The action made no sense within any framework they could comprehend. They didn't know if it was kindness or something else, something far more sinister that their exhausted minds couldn't quite grasp, but their instincts screamed warnings about. Their thoughts raced through a maze of fear and confusion, each turn leading to darker possibilities. Why are they feeding us by hand like this? Are they mocking us? Is this humiliation before something worse? Why do they insist we eat slowly? Are they drawing this out? Do they want to watch us suffer? Is the poison slow acting? Why do they watch us so closely? What are they looking for? What reaction? What sign? The propaganda they had consumed for years roared back to life in their minds. Stories of enemy cruelty, of prisoners abused and degraded, of elaborate psychological tortures designed to break the spirit before destroying the body. Some of the women had worked in offices where reports from the Eastern Front had crossed their desks. Reports that spoke of harsh treatment of German prisoners. If the Soviets were brutal, why would the British be any different? The tension in the camp was suffocating. Thick enough to choke on. You could hear it in the shallow breathing, see it in the wide eyes and rigid postures, feel it in the air itself, which seemed to vibrate with collective anxiety. The British soldiers maintained their calm demeanor, but several looked troubled. This wasn't the reception they had anticipated. Some had sisters or mothers back home. Some had wives. Looking at these frightened women, hungry and terrified, stirred something uncomfortable in their chests. But they had their orders, and more importantly, they understood the medical necessity of what they were doing. "Come on now, love," one British corporal said gently to a young woman who couldn't have been more than 19. His Lancashire accent softened the words. "Just a small bite. Won't hurt you. Promise." The woman stared at him as if he was speaking an alien language, which, in a sense, he was. The concept of enemy compassion didn't translate into her experience. Hunger is a powerful force. It's not merely discomfort. It's a relentless biological imperative that eventually overrides almost everything else, including fear. The human body, when pushed to extremes, will take desperate measures to survive. One woman finally broke. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, old enough to have some perspective, young enough to have strength left. She had been a telephone operator in Berlin, spending long shifts in underground bunkers, connecting calls while the city burned above her. She had Gone 3 days with almost nothing but water and a few bites of hard bread. She looked at the spoon being held patiently near her face. She looked at the British soldier holding it, a man with kind eyes and a patient expression, who looked like he might have been a shopkeeper or a teacher before the war. She looked at the other women, all frozen in the same paralysis of fear. Then she made her decision. Survival trumped terror. She opened her mouth just a little, just enough for the spoon to slip past her lips. The soup touched her tongue, warm, seasoned with actual pieces of potato and carrot and even some meat. The taste was so overwhelming after months of deprivation that tears immediately sprang to her eyes. She swallowed. The warmth traveled down her throat, hit her empty stomach, and her entire body seemed to sigh with relief. Nothing happened. No sudden pain, no bitter aftertaste, no immediate collapse, just warmth and nourishment in the first real food she had tasted in longer than she could remember. The British soldier smiled slightly. There you are. Good. Another. Slowly now. Another spoonful. Another swallow. Other women watched this first pioneer with intense focus. When she didn't collapse, didn't cry out in pain, didn't show any signs of distress, something shifted in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but it was there. Another woman opened her mouth to accept the spoon being offered to her. Then another, like dominoes falling, one by one, the women began to eat. The British soldiers kept up a steady stream of gentle encouragement, repeating the same phrases over and over. Gently now, small bites, not too fast. Longam, lonesome. That's it. Easy does it. The women's eyes continued to dart around the camp, searching for the trap, waiting for the other shoe to drop, anticipating whatever horror they were certain must be coming. But nothing came. No pain, no cruelty, no punishment. Instead, something else began to happen. Something they hadn't experienced in so long they almost didn't recognize it. Their breathing began to steady, the shallow gasps deepening into more normal rhythms. Their shoulders, which had been hunched defensively around their ears, began to lower incrementally. Their hands, which had been bowled into fists or clutching at their own clothes, slowly relaxed. The fear didn't vanish. That would take much longer, weeks or months for some, but it cracked just enough for something new to slip through those fissures, a tiny seed of something that might eventually grow into trust. Only later, after the bowls were empty and the women were resting, truly resting for the first time in days, did the full truth emerge. It came through interpreters, through the few women who spoke some English, through careful explanations from British medical officers who made rounds through the camp. The British soldiers weren't feeding them by hand to control them, to assert dominance, or to humiliate them. They weren't trying to mock their weakness or infantilize them as some form of psychological warfare, and they most certainly weren't trying to poison them. They were trying to save their lives. The women were so severely malnourished that their bodies had entered a dangerous state. Their digestive systems had slowed to a crawl, conserving energy, adapting to starvation. Their blood sugar was dangerously low. Their electrolyte balances were completely disrupted. Their stomachs had shrunk. Their bodies had begun consuming their own muscle tissue for energy, including potentially the muscles of the heart. In this condition, eating too quickly could be catastrophic. It could trigger something called refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal shift in fluids and electrolytes that occurs when nutrition is reintroduced too rapidly to someone who is severely malnourished. The sudden influx of food could cause the body to pull phosphate, potassium, and magnesium from the bloodstream into the cells to process the nutrients. This shift could lead to heart failure, respiratory failure, seizures, or coma. Additionally, their shrunken stomachs couldn't handle normal portions. Eating too much too fast would cause severe cramping, vomiting, and potentially dangerous intestinal blockages. Some women were so weak that even the act of eating, the physical effort required, could exhaust them dangerously if they tried to do it too quickly. The British soldiers had encountered this before. They had been briefed by medical officers who had experience with concentration camp liberations, with freed prisoners of war, with starving civilian populations. They had seen what happened when well-meaning soldiers gave starving people full rations and watched in horror as those people became violently ill or even died from the very food meant to save them. They knew the warning signs, the trembling hands, the hollow eyes, the loose clothing on. skeletal frames, the yellowed skin, the brittle hair. They knew exactly how serious the situation was, and that was why they had made the decision to feed the women by hand, slowly, carefully. One small spoonful at a time. They needed to control the pace to ensure that the reintroduction of food happened gradually enough that these women's bodies could adapt and accept the nourishment without catastrophic consequences. The order that had sounded so strange, so frightening, so impossible to trust, take it slowly, was perhaps the most compassionate command any of these women had received in years. It was the difference between life and death delivered in two simple words. When the truth finally penetrated through the fog of fear and exhaustion, when the women finally understood what had actually happened and why, the reaction was profound. They had expected cruelty. For months, they had been preparing themselves mentally for harsh treatment, for retribution, for the rough justice of victors toward the vanquished. The propaganda had told them the British were vindictive, that prisoners would be treated with the same harshness Germany had shown to its own prisoners. They had expected punishment. They knew they had served the Reich even in minor capacities. They had operated the communications that coordinated military movements. They had helped operate the defenses that had shot down Allied aircraft with crews who had families waiting for them to come home. They expected to answer for that service, to pay some price for their part in the war machine. They had expected to be treated as the enemy because that's precisely what they were. Enemy combatants, enemy auxiliaries, women who had worn German uniforms and served German interests. Why would the British see them as anything else? Instead, they had been treated as human beings, as people in desperate need, as individuals whose lives had value, even though they had been on the opposite side of the war. The British had fed them carefully, patiently, gently, not because it was easy or convenient, but because their lives depended on it. The soldiers had knelt in the mud beside them. They had taken time from their own duties. They had handled spoons and bowls and measured out portions with meticulous care. They had spoken gently when they could have spoken harshly. They had shown patience when they could have shown indifference. The fear that had filled the camp at the beginning of that meal, the terror that had made women recoil from offered food, slowly transformed into something else entirely. It was a complex mixture of emotions that would take weeks to fully process. Relief, profound and overwhelming, that they had survived not just the war, but also its immediate aftermath, that they were safe, at least for now. Gratitude, hesitant at first, but growing stronger for soldiers who had cared enough to protect them from themselves, from the danger that their own hunger posed. This belief that the people they had been taught to fear, to hate, to see as the existential enemy were the very ones keeping them alive. It challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. Shame for some at having believed the worst, at having feared kindness, at having been so thoroughly deceived by the propaganda they had consumed. Confusion because reconciling this reality with years of indoctrination was mentally and emotionally exhausting. And underneath it all, a fragile, tentative sense that perhaps, just perhaps, the future might not be as dark as they had feared. The feeding protocol continued for several days. The British medical officers monitored the women closely, tracking their recovery, adjusting portion sizes gradually as their bodies adapted. The progression was careful and calculated. Small amounts of warm broth and soft bread fed slowly under supervision. Slightly larger portions. Introduction of mashed vegetables, continued supervision, but some women were deemed stable enough to feed themselves with guidance. More varied nutrition. Careful introduction of protein. Most women now eating independently, but still under watchful eyes. Day 4 and beyond. Gradual return to normal portions, though still well below what a healthy person would eat. Continued monitoring for any signs of complications. Throughout this process, something remarkable happened. The initial terror that had defined the first encounter began to dissolve. Not completely. Trust takes time to build, especially when it has been thoroughly destroyed, but incrementally, interaction by interaction, meal by meal. The women began to speak to the British soldiers tentatively at first. A few words of gratitude in broken English. Questions about what would happen to them. Small requests. Could they write to their families? Did anyone know what had happened to Hamburg? Was the war truly over? The soldiers responded with patience and whatever information they could share. Some brought cigarettes to distribute. Others played gramophones in the evening so there could be music. A few organized games for the younger women. Simple things like cards or makeshift football with rolled-up cloth. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Some women remained deeply traumatized, struggling to accept kindness from those they had been taught to fear. Some were dealing with grief for lost family members, destroyed homes, a country that no longer existed in the form they had known. But overall, a shift occurred. What happened in that field outside Hamburg was not an isolated incident. Across occupied Germany in the spring and summer of 1945, British forces encountered thousands of German military personnel, both men and women, in various states of distress and malnutrition. The British Army had learned hard lessons about how to handle mass populations of displaced, defeated, and often desperately hungry people. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in April 1945 had been a horrifying education in what happens when starving people are given food too quickly. Despite the best intentions of British soldiers who opened their own rations to give to the emaciated prisoners, many died from the sudden reintroduction of rich food to systems that couldn't handle it. The medical officers who responded to that crisis developed protocols specifically to prevent such tragedies from repeating. These protocols were then applied across various situations to concentration camp survivors, to prisoners of war, to civilian refugees, and to captured German military personnel. The approach was the same. Assess the level of malnutrition, introduce food slowly and carefully, monitor for complications, and gradually increase portions as the body adapted. It was a massive logistical undertaking. The British Army was confronted with the immense task of managing millions of displaced people across occupied Germany. They were required to impose order, ensure security, initiate the process of denazification, and somehow provide food for enormous populations whose infrastructure had been utterly destroyed. That they invested the time and effort to handle this correctly, even for enemy personnel, reveals not only strict military professionalism but also a core sense of humanity that endured despite 6 years of brutal total war. In the decades that followed, some of these women came forward with their stories. Their testimonies, preserved in archives and oral histories, offer a glimpse into that remarkable moment. "I thought they would beat us," one woman remembered in an interview recorded in the 1970s. "I thought, at best, they would ignore us and let us starve. When that British soldier knelt beside me with a spoon, I was certain it was poisoned. I was convinced I was about to die. When the food was real and I lived, I didn't know how to understand it. I had to rebuild my entire view of the world." Another woman, a former radio operator in Bremen, wrote in her memoirs, "The gentleness was what stunned me most. We had been told the British were cold and mechanical, but the soldier who fed me, his hands shook almost as much as mine. He looked worried. He called me dear in English. I didn't understand then, but later someone explained, he was concerned about you, who had been his enemy. I carry that memory with me always." A third account, from a woman who had operated searchlights for anti-aircraft batteries, reflected, "I later understood that they saved my life that day. If they had simply handed us food and walked away, if they had allowed us to eat as quickly as we wanted, I would have gorged myself. I might have eaten until I became ill, perhaps even until I died." They knew this. They understood us better than we understood ourselves in that moment. That level of care from an enemy changed something deep within them. The instruction, "take it slowly," became a defining instant in their lives. It marked a collision between expectation and reality so stark that it forced a profound reassessment. They had been taught the enemy was inhuman, that defeat would bring unimaginable horrors, that capture meant destruction. Instead, defeat brought carefully measured soup. Capture meant medical supervision. The enemy had medics who understood refeeding syndrome, and soldiers willing to kneel in the mud to ensure prisoners ate safely. This mental dissonance, the gap between anticipated cruelty and received compassion, was overwhelming. It planted doubt about everything else they had been taught. If the propaganda about the British was false, what else had been false? If the enemy could show such humanity, what did that imply about their own side's treatment of prisoners and occupied populations? For some, this became the beginning of a long reckoning with what the right truly was, what it had done, and what they themselves had taken part in, however indirectly. The kindness shown by British soldiers in those first desperate days became a reference point, a moment of clarity amid layers of propaganda and denial. This experience also deeply affected the British soldiers themselves. Many were young men hardened by years of fighting. They had watched comrades die, assaulted fortified beaches, and liberated concentration camps whose horrors would scar them forever. They could easily have justified hostility toward all Germans, including these auxiliary women. The urge to harden themselves rather than show mercy must have been powerful, yet they chose compassion. Some soldiers wrote home, their letters revealing a mixture of relief that the war was over, pride in victory, and a weary sorrow at Germany's devastation. One corporal wrote to his wife, "We're feeding German prisoners today, mostly women. They're terrified of us. It's strange to be feared like this when all we're doing is offering soup." It makes you think about what they've been told about us, and it makes you reflect on what we've been told about them too. They're just people, love, frightened, starving people. War turns us all into monsters, I suppose. But underneath it all, we're still just people. This true story, preserved in military records, oral histories, and personal testimonies, demonstrates something essential about human nature and the decisions we make under extreme conditions. Wars create rigid divisions, us and them, ally and enemy, good and evil, necessary for armies to function, for soldiers to obey orders, for nations to mobilize. Yet those divisions can obscure shared humanity. The British soldiers who fed those women, kneeling in mud and patiently ensuring each spoonful was safely swallowed, who reassured and cared for individuals who had every reason to fear them, chose to see human beings rather than abstract enemies. The German women, forced to push past years of propaganda and immediate terror to accept this compassion, rebuilt their understanding of the world around this unexpected mercy. They learned that enemies could become saviors, that defeat could bring protection, that sometimes the darkest moments come just before light. May 8, 1945 Victory in Europe Day. While celebrations erupted across Allied nations, in a muddy field outside Hamburg, a small group of German women absorbed a profound lesson about humanity, compassion, and the unlikely places where mercy can emerge. The command, "Take it slowly," once terrifying, became the moment they understood they were safe. The people they had been taught to fear had become their guardians. The enemy had become their protectors. This is a verified World War II story, preserved through first-hand accounts, documented military records, and remembered by both the women who endured it and the soldiers who carried it out. It reminds us that even in total war, amid societal collapse, when vengeance and cruelty seem unavoidable, humanity can still prevail. Sometimes mercy comes from the most unexpected source. Sometimes the enemy is the one who saves your life. Sometimes a simple instruction, "Take it slowly," becomes the instant everything changes. The women who lived it never forgot it. Neither did the soldiers who made it happen. It stands as a testament to the capacity for compassion even in the most unlikely circumstances, and a reminder that all humans are capable of both brutality and extraordinary kindness, and that the choice of which path to take, even in the darkest moments, ultimately remains ours alone.